Hello everyone and welcome back to Tarot and Torch. Today we have something a bit different. I saw a beautiful and intriguing post on Instagram by theCemeteryWitch, Wren, who I've been following for a number of years, and I really enjoyed her post about 90s witchcraft. And being a child of the 90s, you know, I always talk about the 90s just kind of nostalgically. I thought that I would talk about not just my witchcraft practice in the 90s, but also kind of bring tarot into the mix and talk a little bit about my tarot practice from the 90s and how that has evolved. So kind of talking about both of them. So I hope that this is something that you find interesting. And if you are also a child of the 90s, I hope that you will comment and let me know what it was like for you. So before we get started, we're going to light a fresh new candle. This is Marshmallow Fireside. Get it clear there. Okay. I love this candle. It's so comforting. Try and get it in frame a little bit more. There we go. So, the 90s was where my practices began, really. I've talked about them a little bit before and kind of, how I began reading tarot in the 90s. And I was only about 11 years old when I started reading tarot, and this was my very first tarot deck that I had begged my grandparents to buy out of a catalog that I had seen that sold all kinds of books. So tarot was definitely my way into witchcraft and occult. And luckily, my grandparents who I grew up with, who raised me, they were somewhat okay with me having strange things. I read a lot of fantasy, so dragons were something that they were used to. It wasn't a big deal for my grandfather to buy me this deck of cards. And I really don't know what they thought when I began asking for witchcraft books, but they were just happy really that I was reading at that time. So I don't even really know that they knew what, witchcraft was exactly. So I know that they didn't approve of witchcraft. But also they trusted, I guess, what I was doing and kind of what I wanted to do. So my first, foray into actual witchcraft was with this book. And I actually commented on Wren's post on Instagram about 90s witchcraft about this, because this was my very first book of witchcraft, and this was of course before I knew what witchcraft was. So Wicca appealed to me because of the beauty of firstly this cover, because Waterhouse was one of the artists that I really fell in love with at that time. I loved just looking at the paintings. They had such a magical quality, and because this book had that cover, it really just drew me right in. And then I saw, of course, that there was witchcraft, and I was like, well, all the better. So I wasn't really even sure exactly what witchcraft entailed at the time, other than knowing that I've always been a nature child. I used to go outside and, stir mud with sticks and create potions and puddles and collect stones. And I also looked at mushrooms and tried to identify them. I had a little notebook that I wrote in and drew sketches of mushrooms in, even though I had no idea what I was doing. I also bird watched and, tried to identify different species of birds, and I did all kinds of things. But back into kind of witchcraft itself, I've always been drawn to nature as a source of magic and connection to the divine. So Wicca is what drew me in for that reason. Now, I am not a Wiccan in that sense. I have not become initiated. I do not practice Wicca as a path, but I did start my path in Wicca. So, and again, the reason why I do love Scott Cunningham. I know a lot of people see him as very love and light and kind of, not a serious magician, or, whatever people are saying about him. But as a beginning, step into witchcraft, I really loved his take, his descriptions, and, a lot of the practices he talks about, with the Lady of the Moon and all of that. Some of that I can understand where, people are looking at it as something being very controversial, I suppose. But I thought it was beautiful. The god and the goddess coming together, that kind of pagan aspect always drew me in too, because I think at heart, paganism really does, I connect to paganism very deeply because of the mythology behind it, the horned god, like Sir Nunos, and, connecting to the moon and drawing down the moon. I do love all of those practices, and I did draw down the moon and drew a circle. Okay, so I did the spells from this book, casting a circle, widening the circle, drawing energy, and that's how I began witchcraft. That was my introduction into witchcraft. And those spells, they worked really well for me. It was something that gave me inspiration, and it was, very empowering. It introduced me into magical herbalism, which now I also incorporate medical herbalism into my work. But I was working with plant oils a lot, essential oils, and which led me to work with plants and using dried herbs, and then going out and foraging and using wild herbs. So this was a beginning for me in so many ways that began in that magical time in the 90s, which I will also just talk about, the time period itself. But, back then in the 90s, there wasn't a lot to learn from, is what I'm trying to get at here. So I found this book. Not only that, I was allowed to find this book. My grandparents purchased this for me as a child. And I worked with it, and I did witchcraft. Now, mind you, I was not allowed to practice witchcraft, so that is something I still had to do in secret, because I honestly, when they saw this cover, they probably thought that Wicca was something historical, because I did read a lot of historical works, like magic of the ancient Egyptians and things like that. So that's probably what they thought, but I was not allowed to practice witchcraft because my grandparents were also Christian. In fact, I went to a Catholic and Pentecostal school, so I grew up in a religious environment, and I had to practice witchcraft in secret. Under the bed, I kept a box of my oils, my herbs, my candles, my salt, and that's really what I had, was a box of treasures that I would take out and practice when everyone went to sleep. So, and as far as I can recall, there was only one time that my grandmother came in and I had candles everywhere, and she assumed that she knew that something strange was happening and probably didn't want to ask me because she was afraid of what I would say. So anyhow, witchcraft was something that was, to me, very nature-based, very magical, in not just in, of course, the magic of the craft itself, but there was something really enchanting about witchcraft. And again, that's because of my view from Scott Cunningham that gave me that sense of witchcraft looking like this. And that is what I wanted, you know, and in many ways I still see my practice this way. Nature-based, with plant spirits, and, you know, having that sense that there's other worlds. I suppose that you could also call what I do now a little bit of hedge witchery, but definitely a green witch kind of basis, although with, of course, with tarot, so that psychic aspect. So witchcraft was, in the 90s for me, it was an exploration into what I could manifest and create, what I could use, you know, resourcefulness to create spells. And I even have this old book of spells and kind of journal entries of my tarot readings. Now, I don't have my original journal. This is a second journal that I started after I filled the other one. So this one starts a little bit later in the early 2000s, so 2009. And this, and don't judge my writing, you know, I was young, but this was a green spell that I did back then. And it was cast for a friend, and they ended up, you know, making a certain sum of money and getting a new job after. So this is just a simple green spell, and this particular spell I kind of made myself. I used some of the correspondences in Scott Cunningham's book, and then I kind of, you know, used my own wording and such. But after that, I did start recording my tarot spreads in the journal. And again, I mean, I was young, I was in a place of looking for jobs and thinking about work and, you know, all of that. So that's what my readings were about. But I am actually, it's interesting to see that I did use spreads back then. And now also the fact that if you'll note that there's 10 different placements in these readings, and that's because I only used the Celtic cross back then. So that's what I started reading with, because that was the typical way we did things, you know, at least when I first started in tarot reading. It was all about the Celtic cross. And but I did go into, let's see, I did a 5-card spread here when I was working at Claire's. So this was a question of if I would be happy working there, you know, just kind of maybe childish things. But I did a 5-card spread for that. So that's when I started kind of using different spreads other than the Celtic cross. So the 90s was a time of magic and mysticism for me. It was kind of branching out into this world of creating my own path, my own reality, knowing that I had control over my reality, and really exploring kind of any talents that I had, because I always was a very sensitive, empathic person. I picked up on feelings of other people, and it's like these things kind of felt very natural to me when I began reading tarot and working with magic. The 90s were also just a very fun time. We had shows like, and movies like The Craft, which of course was so quintessential in witchcraft in that time. And really looking back on it today, it wasn't done horribly. There was a lot of things in The Craft that were kind of legitimate. And, a lot of the spell stores that I went to actually looked like the one from that film. And other things that were out around that time were like Buffy and Angel. And, of course, there were all these elements of magic mixed in with the vampire lore. And shows like Charmed. So all of these movies, these shows kind of built a kind of mythos around witchcraft that I think appealed to a lot of people, including myself. Although I was already reading about, let's see, what was that book called? The Secret Teachings of All Ages. I was learning about chakras. I was very much into spirituality before I even started reading tarot and getting into witchcraft. But it drew me in when I saw these films as well. And it made me feel connected to this kind of secret network of people that did these things. So that leads me to kind of, the decks that I was using. I mentioned the Dragon Tarot. And then the second deck that I was given, actually, this was gifted to me, was the Enchanted Oracle. And this one was a little bit in the early 2000s. So this was after the Dragon deck and after the 90s by a bit. But this one kind of encapsulates what the 90s felt like to me, with the artwork mostly. And this isn't, by far one of my favorite decks or anything like that, but I love the artwork, and it just brings back kind of those memories of a time that, especially fairy artwork was very popular. So tarot practice back then, for me, it was all divinatory. I was still learning about the cards. I was very much only working with the Dragon Tarot and this Oracle. And I didn't really know very much about the history of tarot, because back then everybody assumed that tarot was from ancient Egypt, which, today there's a lot of kind of speculation on that, and there's a lot of other things that tell the story a little bit more historically accurately, like the fact that it was originally a card game in Italy, the tarocchi, and then kind of turned into, here it was more about playing card divination, and then it turned into the tarot cards from there in secret societies like the Golden Dawn. But there was a lot of mysticism around tarot. All of those stories and kind of superstitions around tarot were huge back in the 90s, especially. You could only be gifted your first deck, for instance, which I didn't do because I picked out my deck. Although I didn't buy it, myself, I requested it. So I didn't really believe that was true even back then. But there was people that thought, of course, that it was evil, that it could take your soul. My cousin, actually, I think, was the first person I ever saw a tarot deck, who had a tarot deck, and it was the Rider-Waite. And I remember thinking, those are ugly cards. And, that was just my child's eyes looking at artwork that was very mysterious and strange to me. Something like this, however, appealed to me so much more. So when I saw the dragon deck that I got, that was the one that I wanted. That was a beautiful kind of deck to me. But now I love the Rider-Waite and see the value in it. But, I had a fantastical mind, and when I first got my tarot, I wanted it to be something representative of the magic and the mystery that I felt that tarot had, because so many people treated it that way. Powerful. People thought that it had this power inside of the paper to make your future, and that's really how tarot was perceived, as this mystical thing. I remember actually being young and going to the flea market, and I don't know if any of you have ever had this experience. It was in malls and flea markets where these ladies would have a table and they would do fortune readings with tarot. And I don't know what kind of deck they had, but it was never the normal Rider-Waite. It was always something kind of, I don't know, it had a very different appearance to it. But in any case, there was all of these people that would look at them and kind of whisper, around the table of like how evil it was and they shouldn't be there reading and this and that. And I thought that was so interesting. I was very compelled to get a reading, but of course I didn't have anybody to take me that believed in tarot or that thought that it was a good thing to do. So I never had my reading done until I was old enough to afford it myself and to take myself. But it used to be this thing where, anybody that read tarot, they were like looked down upon in some way, kind of disregarded as a superstitious kind of person, or even worse, someone who was just trying to take your money and, they didn't have anything true to say. So I didn't have an upbringing in which fostered any kind of belief in the supernatural or in tarot itself. And yet somehow I found my way into this path that I've never looked back from since. And I just think that that's so interesting. And I still don't really know how I found it, but it's one of those things where it feels as though it was a past life, that this is knowledge that I've known before. It felt natural to me. So, the 90s just really kind of was at a time when all of this was becoming very popular, and also kind of I believe I heard someone say it was like a renaissance of these things, of these spirituality tools and paths. And I feel that was the same for both witchcraft and tarot. And it's one of those things where it's like people wanted to explore it, but then some people felt a lot of guilt or shame or fear around it as well. And, truth be told, when I first started learning about witchcraft, I kind of had that feeling too, because I had been brought up in a Catholic and Pentecostal environment in which I was told I would get possessed by demons if I did these things. So, it took me a long time. The satanic panic hangover was still there, and people were very afraid. So, and I healed so much through this path of witchcraft and tarot, more than I could ever dream, really. I mean, it healed me in ways that I wasn't even aware of until looking back on it now. But, anything that allows you to explore your spirituality in such a loving and beautiful way as tarot and witchcraft, it's never evil. So if you are one of those people that, battles with that, just know that, you have to trust your heart in these instances. It's not logic that's going to help you. It's what you feel in your heart, if this is healing you or harming you, and that's the path you take, is the one that's healing you. But in any case, this this path was right for me. It's not right for everyone. Not everyone that explored witchcraft stuck with it, and the same thing with tarot. But I'm interested to know, what your experiences were with these. I would say that now that I'm older, that my path has changed in the way that I use the cards. Back then it was all kind of fortune telling for me and not as much psychological exploration. But of course that happens with time. You learn how to read the cards, and then you can kind of go deeper and deeper and deeper. And I did a little of that back then when I first started, but I was still a child, so it's kind of hard to explore your psychological development at that age, but I did some. It was more of kind of a curiosity and something that I just felt really drawn to. But I was also, when my grandfather had become ill, and I was doing readings to see if he would be okay, and then after when he inevitably he did get ill and pass, and after that time I was questioning my spirituality in all senses, because actually I was still fighting with that Christianity belief system that I wasn't sure was mine. And so I did come through that kind of walking away from Christianity, and I also did a lot of spirit readings for my grandfather kind of after he passed, which soothed my heart and helped me to kind of get over that loss, because he was more like a father to me. He raised me, and that was a very difficult time. So tarot became a really healing, empowering tool for me at that point, because I saw it as a bridge that I could connect and communicate with him through the tarot. But in any case, I'm interested to know kind of how your path changed, if it changed, if you did readings in the 90s or early 2000s, and what that was like for you. So I hope that you kind of enjoyed this little kind of journey back into the 90s and 2000s. I would love to see everybody else's thoughts and experiences on this as well. And as always, I will talk with all of you very, very soon.